On a quiet Sunday morning, the church was filled with worshipers, their prayers rising like incense to the heavens. But amidst the familiar songs and sermons, something extraordinary happened. A man resembling Jesus entered the sanctuary, his presence commanding attention. What he did next would forever change the lives of those present. This is the story of how one man's appearance, so closely tied to the image of Christ, stirred hearts, ignited faith, and left an unforgettable mark on the congregation. It was an ordinary Sunday morning in St. Luke's Church, a modest building with tall stained glass windows that bathed the sanctuary in soft hues of blues and reds. The congregation had gathered as they always did, filling the pews with familiar faces, the sound of whispered greetings, and the rustle of hymnals being opened. The choir's harmonies soared through the room, a familiar melody that seemed to wrap itself around everyone's hearts. Just as the final note of the opening hymn faded, the doors at the back of the church creaked open. Heads turned instinctively, and the murmur of the congregation fell silent. A man stepped into the sanctuary. His presence was striking, not because he entered with a grand gesture, but because of how he carried himself. He seemed calm and deliberate, his movements almost otherworldly. His appearance was what truly captured the room. Dressed in a simple robe that resembled garments worn in ancient times, his hair was shoulder length, and his beard was full and well kept. It was impossible not to draw comparisons to the image of Jesus Christ depicted in countless paintings and films. For a moment, the man stood there, scanning the room as if he were looking for something or someone. Then he began to walk slowly toward the pews. The congregation watched in stunned silence. No one dared to move or speak. He didn't rush, but there was something purposeful in the way he moved, as though each step was measured. He chose a seat near the back, settling in quietly. Some of the children tugged on their parents' sleeves, asking in whispers if that was Jesus. Their parents shushed them, but their own expressions betrayed their unease and curiosity. At first, many assumed there must be some kind of dramatization. Perhaps the church had arranged for an actor to surprise them with a lesson on faith or humility. But as the moments passed, it became clear that this man wasn't part of any planned event. The pastor, seated at the front, exchanged a puzzled glance with the choir director. Even he didn't seem to know who the visitor was. As the service continued, the air felt charged with an unusual energy. People couldn't help but steal glances at the man. His face was serene, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't appear uncomfortable or out of place. If anything, he seemed more at home in the church than anyone else. The service moved forward, as planned. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered, and the pastor approached the pulpit to deliver his sermon. But the unease lingered in the air. Who was this man? Why did he look so much like the Savior they prayed to and sang about? No one could focus entirely on the service. The man's presence had cast a spell over the congregation, and everyone was waiting for something to happen, though no one could say what. Pastor Mark began his sermon, his voice steady but distracted. "Today, we're talking about love and forgiveness," he announced, glancing briefly at the mysterious man in the back. "Two of the greatest commandments Jesus gave us." As he spoke, the man stood. The movement was subtle, but enough to draw the congregation's attention. Gasps rippled through the pews as he began to walk toward the front. The pastor stopped mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open, as the man reached the foot of the altar steps and turned to face the congregation. The room was silent now, so quiet that the sound of the man's breath seemed to echo. He extended his hand toward the pastor, who, without hesitation, handed him the microphone. Pastor Mark wasn't sure why he complied so easily. It was as though the man's presence carried an authority that was both gentle and impossible to deny. When the man began to speak, his voice was soft, but carried the weight of conviction. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked, scanning the room with eyes that seemed to see through every soul. "You are here because you seek God, because you desire to walk in His ways. But how often do you leave this place and forget what He has commanded?" His words fell over the congregation like a wave. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, captivated. "Faith is not what you do in this building," he continued. "It is how you live every day. It is how you love, how you forgive, how you serve. Too many of you have made your faith a ritual instead of a way of life." The man's words were not angry or condemning, yet they struck the heart of every listener. His voice was steady, filled with compassion but also urgency. "What good is it to say you follow Christ if your neighbor is hungry and you do not feed him? What good is it to pray for forgiveness if you refuse to forgive your brother?" The congregation was mesmerized. Some were nodding in agreement, tears streaming down their faces. Others sat motionless, their minds racing with conviction. The man's gaze was unrelenting, yet comforting. It was as if he saw every flaw and loved them anyway. Pastor Mark stood to the side, humbled and awestruck. He had been a pastor for over 20 years, but he had never seen anything like this. The man's presence, his words, and even his silence carried a power that defied explanation. The man stepped closer to the altar, placing the microphone gently on the pulpit. He turned once more to the congregation, his voice rising slightly. "You are the hands and feet of Christ. You are His body on earth. If you believe in Him, then show it. Not just here, but out there." With those words, he bowed his head for a moment, then turned and walked toward the side of the sanctuary. No one stopped him. No one dared to. As he left the pulpit, a quiet hum of realization spread through the room. They weren't sure who he was, but they knew they had been in the presence of something holy. What had begun as an ordinary Sunday was now etched in their minds as a moment of divine encounter. The man's words hung in the air, his challenge clear. Faith was no longer something they could compartmentalize. It was meant to be lived, every single day. The silence in the sanctuary was thick as the man stood at the front, his presence alone filling the space with an indescribable reverence. After delivering his stirring message, he paused, allowing his words to settle in the hearts of the congregation. For a moment, it seemed as though his work was done, as though he would leave the church as quietly as he had entered. But then he did something that would shake everyone to their core. The man turned to face the congregation fully, his gaze sweeping across the room. He raised his hands slightly, palms upward, as if inviting them to respond. His voice was gentle but commanding as he spoke. "If any among you carry burdens, if any among you are in need of healing, whether of the body, the heart, or the spirit, come forward." For a moment, no one moved. The congregation, still reeling from the weight of his words, seemed unsure of what to do. But then, from the second row, a mother gently nudged her son forward. The boy, no more than 10 years old, limped toward the man with visible hesitation. His left leg was braced in metal supports, and his steps were slow and deliberate. The sound of his brace clinking against the floor echoed in the stillness. The man knelt down to meet the boy at eye level. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and looked into his eyes with such tenderness that it brought tears to the eyes of those watching. "What is your name?" the man asked softly. "Jacob," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And what do you wish for, Jacob?" the man asked. The boy hesitated, glancing back at his mother before answering. "To run," he said simply. The man smiled, a warm and encouraging smile that seemed to radiate peace. "Do you believe that God can help you run?" he asked. Jacob nodded, his eyes wide with hope. The man placed his hands gently on the boy's braced leg and bowed his head. The congregation held its collective breath as he began to pray. His words were quiet and unhurried, spoken with a deep sense of intimacy with the divine. "Heavenly Father," he said, "you are the creator and the healer. You knit us together in our mother's wombs, and you know every bone, every sinew, and every cell. In the name of your Son, bring strength to Jacob's leg. Let him run as he dreams." When the prayer ended, the man looked up at Jacob and nodded. "Take off the brace," he said. The room erupted in whispers. Jacob looked uncertain, his hands trembling as he reached for the straps of his brace. His mother hurried forward, kneeling beside him, her face a mixture of fear and hope. Together they removed the brace, revealing his thin, weakened leg. The boy hesitated, his eyes darting to the man as if seeking reassurance. "Stand," the man encouraged, "and walk." Jacob took a tentative step, then another. His movements were slow at first, but with each step, his confidence grew. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the boy began to walk normally, then to jog, and finally, to run down the aisle, his laughter ringing out like a bell. Tears streamed down his mother's face as she clasped her hands to her mouth. Gasps and cries of joy erupted from the congregation, some standing and clapping, others falling to their knees in prayer. The man, still kneeling, smiled as he watched the boy's joy. He rose to his feet, turning once more to the congregation. "This is the power of faith," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It is not I who healed this boy, but the one who works through faith. It is your belief that moves mountains, that restores what is broken, that brings light into the darkness." People began to come forward, one by one. An elderly woman with a cane approached, her hands shaking as she reached out to the man. He prayed over her, and she stood straighter, her steps steadier as she returned to her seat without the cane. A middle-aged man, eyes red with tears, confessed his struggles with addiction. The man placed a hand on his shoulder, and a wave of peace seemed to wash over him, his tears flowing freely as he knelt in prayer. Even those without physical ailments came forward. A young woman, visibly distraught, whispered about the pain of a broken relationship. The man held her hands and prayed for her heart to be mended. A father with his 2 children wept openly as he asked for guidance to be a better husband and parent. Each encounter was deeply personal, the man giving every individual his full attention, as if they were the only person in the room. The sanctuary transformed into a place of miracles and renewal. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of awe that was almost tangible. Those who remained in the pews wept, prayed, or simply watched in reverence, their hearts swelling with faith and wonder. Many whispered to themselves or to those beside them, asking the same question: who was this man? Was he truly sent by God? Could it be Jesus himself? As the stream of people slowed, the man returned to the front of the sanctuary. He raised his hands once more, and the room grew silent. "You have seen today what faith can do," he said. "But do not forget, miracles are not the foundation of faith. They are a sign, a reminder of what is possible. True faith is found in love and service, in living as Christ taught us. Go now, and let your faith be seen in your actions." His words carried a finality that stilled every heart. Then, without another word, he turned and began to walk toward the exit. The congregation watched in silence, too overwhelmed to move or speak. Some tried to follow, but when they reached the door, the man was gone, as though he had vanished into the morning light. For hours after the service, people lingered in the sanctuary, sharing their experiences, praying together, and marveling at what they had witnessed. The man's presence had left a mark not just on their bodies or their emotions, but on their very souls. What they had experienced was more than miraculous. It was transformative. They knew they had encountered something divine, something that would shape the rest of their lives. The sanctuary was still buzzing with a mix of awe and reverence long after the mysterious man had left. The congregation remained seated, some praying quietly, others weeping, and many deep in thought. The miracles they had witnessed and the man's challenge to them lingered in the air like a sacred charge. Yet, his final words, "Let your faith be seen in your actions," stirred something deeper, something that would not let them return to their lives as they had been before. In the days that followed, the impact of the man's visit rippled through the small community like a stone dropped into still waters. At first, many found themselves grappling with the enormity of what they had witnessed. Was the man truly sent by God? Was he Jesus, as some of the children innocently suggested? Or was he a messenger, someone called to remind them of their purpose? Whatever the answer, his words and actions were impossible to ignore. Pastor Mark, who had been shaken to his core by the encounter, wrestled with his own sense of inadequacy. He had spent years delivering sermons, organizing church events, and counseling his congregation. But he now realized how much of his ministry had been confined within the walls of the church. The man's challenge echoed in his mind. Faith is not what you do in this building. It is how you live every day. Determined to respond, he called an emergency meeting of the church leadership that week. The meeting began with an unusual sense of urgency. The church elders, deacons, and volunteers gathered in the fellowship hall, the room unusually quiet as they waited for Pastor Mark to speak. He stood at the head of the table, his Bible open, and began with a simple but powerful question. "Are we living our faith as Christ taught us?" he asked, his voice heavy with conviction. "Or have we grown comfortable, keeping our faith confined to Sunday mornings in this building?" The room remained silent, the question hanging in the air. Finally, one of the elders, an older man named Harold, spoke up. "We've done good work here, Pastor. We've kept this church running. We've held events, and we've helped some people. But I think we could be doing more." Another voice chimed in, this time from one of the younger members, a woman named Sarah. "I've been thinking about what the man said," she admitted, "about being the hands and feet of Christ. There's so much need in our community. People who are hungry, struggling, lonely. Maybe it's time we stopped waiting for them to come to us and started going to them." Her words sparked a wave of agreement. One by one, the members began to voice their thoughts, confessing their own complacency and sharing ideas for how they could begin to live out the faith they professed. Pastor Mark listened, his heart swelling with hope. It was clear that the man's visit had not only stirred individuals, but had planted the seeds of transformation in the entire church. Over the next few weeks, those seeds began to bear fruit. The church, which had once been a quiet presence in the community, became a hub of activity. They organized food drives, collecting donations from local businesses and distributing meals to families in need. A group of volunteers started visiting the elderly and homebound, offering companionship and assistance with daily tasks. Another team began working with a local shelter, providing clothes, bedding, and support for those experiencing homelessness. The changes weren't limited to physical acts of service. The church also opened its doors in new ways, hosting support groups for people struggling with addiction, grief, or financial hardships. Bible studies became places of honest discussion and accountability as members sought to apply the teachings of Jesus to their daily lives. Prayer meetings became gatherings of encouragement and inspiration, where testimonies of change were shared, and the man's challenge was revisited again and again. one of the most transformative initiatives came from an unexpected source. Jacob, the boy who had been healed during the service, had become something of a symbol of hope for the congregation. His joy and enthusiasm were contagious, and his family, once quiet and reserved, had become active participants in the church's new mission. Inspired by Jacob's experience, his parents suggested creating a program for children with disabilities, offering support and opportunities for them to thrive. The church embraced the idea wholeheartedly, and within weeks, they had established a vibrant ministry that touched countless lives. As the church's efforts grew, so did the sense of purpose among its members. People who had once felt disconnected from their faith found themselves renewed, their lives filled with meaning and direction. Neighbors who had never stepped foot in the church began to take notice, drawn by the genuine love and care they saw in the congregation's actions. Attendance at Sunday services increased, not because of flashy programs or marketing, but because people saw the church living out the message of Christ. Despite the many successes, the journey was not without its challenges. The work was demanding, and there were moments of doubt and discouragement. Resources were stretched thin, and conflicts occasionally arose as people navigated the complexities of serving others. Yet, in those moments, the memory of the mysterious man's visit served as a guiding light. His words, "It is your belief that moves mountains, that restores what is broken, that brings light into the darkness," became a mantra that sustained them. One evening, months after the man's visit, Pastor Mark stood before the congregation during a special service of reflection and gratitude. The sanctuary was packed, the air buzzing with a sense of anticipation. As he looked out over the faces of his congregation, faces that now radiated a new sense of purpose, he felt a deep sense of awe. "This church is no longer the same," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "And it's not because of a single man's visit, as powerful as that was. It's because we took his message to heart. We've stopped being just a church, and we've started being the body of Christ. Every act of kindness, every moment of service, every life that has been touched, it's all a testament to what happens when we let our faith guide our actions." As he spoke, the congregation nodded, their hearts resonating with his words. They knew that the transformation they had experienced wasn't just about programs or initiatives. It was about a shift in their very identity, a renewal of their commitment to live out their faith in tangible, sacrificial ways. Though the mysterious man had disappeared as quickly as he had come, his presence continued to echo in their lives. For them, he was more than a visitor. He was a messenger, a reminder of what it truly meant to follow Christ. And as they left the sanctuary that evening, their hearts were filled with a shared determination to keep carrying his message forward, one act of love at a time. Months turned into years, but the memory of the man's visit to St. Luke's church remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. His words, his actions, and the undeniable sense of divine presence he carried had left an indelible mark on the congregation. For those who had been there that day, it was a story they would tell for the rest of their lives, not out of pride, but out of the deep conviction that something holy had occurred. The transformation sparked by his visit became a defining chapter in the church's history. What began as a surge of activity and outreach in the weeks following his appearance had grown into a sustained mission that reshaped not just the church, but the entire community. St. Luke's was no longer a small, quiet congregation tucked away in a modest building. It had become a beacon of light for the town and beyond. The changes were evident everywhere. The church's new ministry for children with disabilities had expanded, partnering with local schools and healthcare providers to offer therapies, recreational programs, and educational support. Jacob, the boy who had been healed, had become a symbol of hope and determination. Now a teenager, he often spoke at church events, sharing his story and inspiring others to trust in God's power and love. The food drives and outreach programs had also grown into full-fledged initiatives. A once abandoned community center had been renovated into a hub for services, offering free meals, a clothing bank, and workshops for job training and financial literacy. Volunteers from the church, alongside members of the community, staffed the center daily, creating a space where those in need could find not only resources, but also dignity and compassion. Perhaps the most remarkable change, however, was the spiritual renewal that had swept through the congregation. The man's challenge to live out their faith had sparked a hunger for deeper discipleship. Bible studies became places of lively discussion and mutual accountability, where members challenged one another to apply Scripture to their everyday lives. Prayer meetings grew in attendance and fervor, with many testifying to personal breakthroughs and newfound purpose. The church's impact began to extend far beyond its immediate community. News of their transformation spread through social media, local news outlets, and word of mouth. Other churches reached out, asking how they could adopt similar initiatives. St. Luke's members eagerly shared their experiences, emphasizing that their journey began with a simple willingness to listen and respond to the man's challenge. Despite all the growth and success, the congregation never lost sight of the core lesson the man had imparted. Faith was not about grand gestures or seeking recognition, but about love in action. Every project, every act of service was grounded in the understanding that they were not building their own legacy, but carrying out Christ's mission. Among those most deeply affected by the man's visit was Pastor Mark. His leadership had undergone a profound transformation. No longer content to simply manage the church, he had embraced a role as a servant leader, walking alongside his congregation in their shared mission. He often spoke of the man's visit as a personal turning point, confessing that it had reminded him of the sacred responsibility of shepherding others in authentic faith. One day, as Pastor Mark prepared for his Sunday sermon, he found himself reflecting on the man's mysterious identity. Was he Jesus himself, as some still believed? A messenger or angel? A deeply faithful man sent to awaken their community? Pastor Mark realized that the answer, though tantalizing, no longer mattered as much as it once had. What mattered was the undeniable truth that the man had carried, that faith is alive only when it is expressed through love, service, and obedience to God. The church's story continued to unfold, but the most striking evidence of its transformation was found in the lives of its people. Families who had once felt fractured and distant spoke of newfound unity, grounded in their shared commitment to living out their faith. Individuals who had once been passive in their beliefs now described their lives as vibrant and purposeful, filled with opportunities to serve and grow. Even those outside the church felt the ripple effects of what had happened. Local businesses, schools, and civic leaders began partnering with St. Luke's on community projects, inspired by the church's example of selfless service. For many who had been skeptical of Christianity or disillusioned with religion, the actions of the church offered a glimpse of something genuine and transformative. One of the most moving examples came from a man named Tom, a longtime atheist who had lived near the church for years. Tom had always dismissed religion as hypocritical and irrelevant, but the changes he witnessed at St. Luke's made him reconsider. After months of observing from the sidelines, he attended a Sunday service, sitting quietly in the back. He was struck not only by the authenticity of the worship, but also by the warmth of the people who welcomed him without judgment. Over time, Tom began attending regularly, eventually confessing his newfound faith and becoming one of the church's most active volunteers. For all the lives that had been touched, the congregation never grew complacent. They knew that their mission was far from finished. The man's visit had not been a moment of closure, but a beginning, a call to carry the torch of faith and love into the world. Every year on the anniversary of his appearance, the church held a special service of remembrance and rededication. They would read the scriptures he had referenced, share testimonies of what God had done in their midst, and renew their commitment to live as the hands and feet of Christ. On one such anniversary, Pastor Mark addressed the congregation, his voice filled with emotion. "We don't know why God chose to send that man to us," he said, "but we do know this. It wasn't just for a moment, or for us alone. It was a reminder of who we are called to be and what we are called to do. Let us never forget that faith is not a feeling or a ritual. It is a way of life, and let us never stop sharing that truth with the world." As the congregation stood to sing, their voices rose in harmony, a powerful reminder of their shared journey. Though the man's visit was now a distant memory, its impact remained alive in every act of service, every life transformed, and every heart renewed. The mysterious visitor may have left, but his challenge and the God he pointed to continued to shape their lives, carrying them forward in a story that was still being written.